Today we're going to change the oil filter housing gasket on my OM617 turbo diesel. So this is a OM617 turbo diesel, of course, 5-cylinder. If you know what OM617, you know that's what all that means. Anyway, oil filter adapter housing gasket is leaking on this thing. Now, it was just slowly leaking, and I made the mistake of deciding that I would go try to re-torque the bolts. They were all tight except for one. One of them took just a little bit, and I think that made it worse. Definitely didn't help. So it's leaking. We're gonna need to replace the gasket. It's not too bad of a job. It's just really tight quarters. All right, so first steps, and I'm gonna give you what we're gonna do up top, and then we'll go up underneath and we'll go over the things underneath. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go ahead and take the top off of the oil filter adapter, just like you were gonna change your oil filter. And what that's gonna do is that's gonna allow the oil to drain back into the pan from the oil filter housing. So that's gonna help prevent such a mess. So we're gonna do that, let it drain for a minute. And then I'm gonna go and undo these oil cooler lines. So you're gonna need a 1-inch wrench and an 1 1/16. Now, I'm sure there's metric equivalents to that, but I don't have a lot of large metric wrenches, so I just use standard wrenches. They fit just fine. Your 1 inch is going to be the backup, and what that's doing is that's keeping the fitting from inside the oil filter housing from turning, and then your 1 1/16 goes on the oil cooler line itself. So once you break those loose, I like to use since these wrenches are kind of long and difficult to get in there, I use adjustable wrenches once they're broke loose. They work just fine, because you're not dealing with a lot of torque after they're broke loose. So I've got this little stubby adjustable wrench. Works great for getting down in there and getting those oil cooler lines off. It's really short, works great. Great little tool to have. Now, I'm not using this to break the line loose, I'm using good wrenches. So once you get the top line off, you kind of get it out of the way, then you can get to the bottom line. So I'm trying to focus in on the top line there. Top line, and then right below it in the center of your screen, you can kind of see it right there. That's your bottom one. Top one's in the way, so you'll just get on it after you get the top one out of the way. Then you have your clamps. You're gonna undo this bolt right in there. That'll undo the clamp that kind of holds the lines. That allows you to move the lines out of the way. So I'm gonna do that after I get the top line loose. I mean, you could do it before, but then that'll allow you to move that top line out of the way. Just be careful, with the flexible end of the lines. You don't want to cause them to leak. These are in good shape, and hopefully they don't leak afterwards. So we're ready to go underneath now. What we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to undo the oil feed line that goes to the, I think it goes to the oil gauge, but oil pressure gauge. If you see that line kind of in the middle, that's what we have to undo. So we're gonna go up underneath, it's easier to get to, and we can just unthread that from the housing. Now, if you can see our housing itself,
you'll see there's right in the middle of your screen, there's an Allen head bolt. There's 5 Allen head bolts that hold the housing to the block. So that's going to be the next step after we undo that feed line. And it's very tight quarters there. Now, I ordered my gasket through Mercedes Source. It's supposed to be a waffle gasket, and it is, the one I got from Mercedes Source. OEM was a waffle style gasket, and supposedly they're the only ones you can get that OEM gasket from. If you get the Victor Reigns, it's just gonna be, I think it's just a paper gasket. But supposedly that waffle style gasket is a much better quality gasket. So I went ahead, I don't want to do this again. I just bought it from Mercedes Source. And what they'll include in your package is this shortened Allen wrench. Now this is a 6mm wrench. I may use it some, but what I like to use is get yourself a little set of these. These are just hex keys, metric hex keys. So you got a 6mm in there. And then there's 2 tools I use with this. One is this little ratchet, and it'll hold those hex keys in there. Now, you don't have much leverage with this thing, but it works really well. The other thing I have is this Tekton 1/4 inch ratchet wrench. Now this will also hold those hex keys. So you can get these in there, and you've got a ratchet to undo it. It's got a swivel head. This right here, you could probably skip getting this. I mean, I've got this just because I already had it, but this is super handy. So the combination of these 3 tools, we will get in there and undo all those bolts in that tight spot. Quick overview of the bolts that hold the housing to the block. As you can see right above this lower oil fitting, there is a 6mm Allen, and then clamped in here in the frame rail, between the frame rail or whatever you want to call it. No, that one's steering box. Between the steering box and the oil cooler housing, you've got a 6mm Allen, so that's bolt number 2. And then get you in here. I have to see it from underneath. Cramped in here. See it? There's bolt number 3. You can see it from underneath better, but bolt number 3 right there. I'll show you from underneath. There's that bolt number 3, bolt number 4, and bolt number 5. There's your oil feed line for the gauge, oil feed line for the turbo. Kind of ran into an issue. The oil pressure line, the one that feeds the gauge, and it's right there kind of in the center of your screen. It's a plastic line, you know, metal, from what I can tell it's a metal fitting, but that fitting will not come out. So normally, you know, if I had a brake line or something, a metal brake line with the fitting that wouldn't come out, you know, and it felt like the line wrench is gonna round off, you know, I'd put some heat on it, but can't do that here because we've got a plastic line. So my next thing would normally be, you know, maybe some vice grips, but I really just can't get them in there. It's just too tight. So I think what we're gonna do is we're going to leave it alone. I'm gonna see if we can do this without taking that off. The other option we could do is undo it from the gauge and thread the line out from the firewall, or if we can maybe drop it down a little bit, I could get some vice grips on it and try to get it off. But what I think I'm gonna try to do is see if we can come up with that housing and maybe just kind of sit it on the steering gearbox, and that would give us enough room to get in, clean the block, clean the housing without actually removing the housing from the car, and then we could just leave that line attached, is kind of my thought. But like I said, worst case scenario, if we can just move this housing somewhere, we can get some vice grips on there and we can probably get it off. It's just, I can't, my line wrench won't do it. I also tried these crow's foot wrenches, or whatever you want to call them, but
they're not doing it either. They're wanting to round it. So it's just not wanting to come off. Like I said, vice grips probably do it, but I just can't get them in there to do it. And I've just got a bungee around the housing just to help keep it from falling once we get it undone. So yeah. Undid some vacuum lines just to get them out of the way. It's kind of tight quarters. One of the brake booster, and then anything that was kind of crossing over the oil cooler or oil filter adapter. But bungee worked great. It's kind of holding it there. I've pulled it up a little bit and set it on top of the power steering gearbox. I think that will give us enough room to probably clean this thing up from underneath. Make sure to have an oil pan down underneath, because even though you drain the filter housing, there's probably some still in it. And of course, we drained some down in our pan down there. So it's off now. All I got to do is kind of clean up the surfaces of the oil cooler and the block itself. And then we're actually ready for our gasket. So I'm going to take some time to do some cleaning. Carefully cleaned up the razor blade. And we are ready to go back together. So I'm gonna get my gasket. Gonna put it on the oil cooler, let the bolts hold it on there, and try to get it into place. The bungee will kind of help us guide it, is my thought. Help steady it and kind of hold it in place. And I think I'll try to start it from underneath here. I am going to put a little Permatex 3 on the threads. Don't know, I don't think you have to on these. You might want to look it up. I've got some, so I'm just going to put it on there just to make sure. I don't think any of these are through bolts, but just in case, it'll keep them from leaking. It also, that stuff doesn't harden, so it also kind of helps, kind of works as a anti-seize as well. So we're gonna put some on it. Makes me feel better about it, but probably not necessary. Here's our original gasket. As you can see, the oil cooler side of it came off cleanly. I did kind of scrape it just to be safe, but here's our other side, the block side. You can see it left some material that we had to go back and scrape off, but it was stuck to the block. And when I peeled it off, of course, it left the missing pieces on the block. This is a metal gasket with gasket material attached to both sides. I think the new gaskets you get, most of them are just a paper gasket, or maybe not paper, but just a regular gasket material. This one from Mercedes source is where I got it. It's supposed to be better than the original one. Kind of looks like there's metal in there. Yeah, I think there is. So it's supposed to be better than any other gasket you can get other than OEM, and I couldn't find an OEM gasket, so I went with the Mercedes source. I don't want to do this again, so I did it. I went with it. To be honest, there are instructions I think included with this. I haven't even looked at them. So there may be some tricks in there that he has to offer, but that's where I got the gasket. I feel good about it. It looks like a good quality gasket. And I used the little stubby or cut off Allen wrench he included as well. So it worked out. Like I said, I'd rather pay up and get a better quality gasket than do this job over again. So I'm gonna go slip this thing on there. You really can't see anything. I'll maybe set up time lapse. We'll set up time lapse, but I doubt you're gonna be able to see anything. Well, I forgot to start time lapse before I got started. I did eventually remember and come back up here and start it, but I did miss the positioning of this, and I'm telling you, use the bungee and clear some vacuum lines out of the way. I think those two things made this job so much easier. This bungee, it was like having a third hand. There was enough stuff in the way to put tension on or put drag on the oil cooler or oil filter housing, that when I was pulling it and getting it in position, it pretty much stayed. There was just enough tension on that bungee or maybe it was the weight of the oil cooler or whatever. It pretty much stayed where I put it. So as far as, lining it up, getting the gasket on, getting the bolts in, super easy. And the thing just stayed in place while I, threaded bolts in it. I didn't have to hold the oil cooler housing. Keep saying oil cooler housing. Oil filter. I mean, technically it's an oil cooler, oil filter housing adapter. It's got the fittings for the oil cooler, but anyway. Worked out awesome. So it's bolted in place, and they are torqued, and by torqued I mean I tightened them by hand till I felt like they were tight, because there's no way you could get a torque wrench on these bolts to torque them unless you had the engine out of the car. But yeah, I gotta scrounge up some new gaskets, or new not gaskets, but sealing washers. Why am I drawing a blank on what they're called? But I gotta source up some new ones for the pressure line for the turbo. I don't want to reuse these, so you shouldn't reuse them. So I'm gonna see what I've got to replace those, and then we'll get this thing all finished back up. Got some new crush washers, so we'll go ahead and put those in. Put the banjo bolt back in for the oil feed line for the turbo. I'm gonna tighten up the oil cooler lines, and I think we should be in good shape. Still got to put a new oil filter in it, drain the oil, all that kind of stuff, but yeah, that's just kind of extra stuff we're doing, part of routine maintenance on this thing. And new crush washers installed, and it is tight. So I'm gonna hit all this with everything's done and tight, and we're all in good shape. Oil cooler lines are tight. I'm gonna give this thing a rinse off with brake cleaner, and then I'm gonna do some other oil leak fixes on this thing, and then I'm going to hit it with some degreaser and really get this thing clean up underneath, because it is just covered in oil. This thing was leaking very badly. Well, it's now night time. Checked everything for leaks. We're all in good shape, and looks like we've at least fixed that leak. We've still got some pressure washing to do and all that kind of stuff. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment down below, hit the like button, and subscribe for more. Check the description. I'll try to put some links to any special tools, you know, that Tekton 1/4 inch ratchet wrench, and maybe the little stubby adjustable wrench. Put those in there, and then I'll link over to Mercedes source as well for this gasket if you want to pick that one up. I think that's probably the best gasket for this application. Anyway, thanks again.